In our study tonight, if you would please turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 14. We're going to be moving rather quickly because there's some other things that I want to talk about as it pertains to the conquest. But I want to look at some of these places on the map during the period of wilderness wandering. For just a moment, they're coming up out of the land of Egypt and their period of wandering. So we're going to be looking beginning in Exodus chapter 14 where they come to the Red Sea. You'll notice this discussion beginning about verse 10 of the text. And as they came to the Red Sea, of course, Pharaoh has determined he's not going to let them go, and he pursues them. And when they came to the edge of the Red Sea, saw the wilderness beside them, the Egyptian army led by Pharaoh behind them, what did the people want to do? Let's go back to Egypt, yeah, because we got good food to eat and stuff back there. All right, we've forgot all about the miracles that God did. I want to note that with you because we're going to come over that over and over again. The blessings that God bestowed upon them, the miracles, and then how they reacted when things did not seem so well for them. Now, when they came to the Red Sea, they began to fuss and they want to go back, of course, and what did Moses tell them? Very important. What did he tell them? If you don't know what to do, you want to go back, no, what do? Stand still and behold the salvation of the Lord. You'll see that in verse 13 it is. And of course the point that we're trying to make is if you don't know what to do, rather than to just stand there and fuss and complain, find out what to do. Some folks think they just need to go forward and do something, and that don't work. We see that here. The indication is stand still and behold the salvation of the Lord. And so that's where we are. So they come up out of the land of Egypt. They cross the Red Sea. We don't know exactly where. And of course, when you look at various maps, this is the traditional map that you will find of where they came across the Red Sea. And of course, you need to note that there's a question mark. We don't know exactly where they crossed. In fact, I mentioned to you that I wanted to show you this slide. There are those who believe that the traditional crossing, and I don't know if you can see that as well, the traditional crossing, either here or here, may or may not be correct because we don't know where they crossed. Others suggest perhaps they came across up here actually on land and came across and then crossed over into what would have been the region of Arabia, the wilderness of Shur. We're not real positive about where some of these places are. And I ran across this just in some studies not too long ago that we named the Sinai Peninsula because we thought that Mount Sinai was here, and so we named that the Sinai Peninsula. When the Sinai Peninsula, as we sometimes call it, some have suggested that Mount Sinai may actually be on this side of the crossing area. I don't know, but that's all beside the point. But I did want you to see the map and know that there are other possibilities of where they crossed because we don't know where they crossed. But one of the things that we do know as we look at some of these traditional maps, we know some of the events that occurred after they crossed, and that's what we want to focus our attention on, and how that they fussed and complained, and this in particular I want you to pay attention to. This time element, you know, we put events on a timeline for a reason, and one of the things that is accomplished when we look at a timeline is we can see God said this way back here. And it come to pass, for example, as he spoke to Abraham way back here in Genesis 12, and we notice on the timeline it took 430 years for that to come to pass, okay? So the timeline is real helpful to us for a lot of reasons. But also, rather than to see just long periods of time, like the 430-year period, from the time of the giving of the promise to Abraham to the time that it began to be fulfilled at Mount Sinai with the giving of the law and identifying these people as a great nation, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things we want to notice about a timeline is some of the things occurred just really on the heels of some very important things. Very short period of time. For example, on this, Israel crossed the Red Sea somewhere, we don't know where. They traveled 3 days. 3 days into the wilderness, and that brings us, of course, to Exodus chapter 15, and what do they begin to do? 3 days after they crossed the Red Sea, the Great Sea on dry ground, what'd they do? Begin to fuss and complain. Be impressed with that. What has happened just prior to the crossing of the Red Sea? Well, we've got the 10 plagues, and all of the plagues showed the superiority of God over the gods of the Egyptians, all of them. And one of the things that we note in that is when Pharaoh said, "Who is Jehovah that I should obey his voice?" Well, we know that within a short period of time, he was soon to find out. And now what we're finding out is that one of the things that God wanted the people of Israel to know is that you might know who I am. Now, Pharaoh understood that. He found out the hard way. The Egyptians found out who God is when compared to their various gods, and they found out the hard way. And I would suggest to you that a part of the miracles that God did to bring them up out of the land of Egypt was so that they themselves would know who God is. But here we are 3 days out. And what do they know about God? Fuss and complain, fuss and complain. You see, we're out here in the wilderness. We're 3 days out, and we're thirsty. We need water. And so we complain, and we complain. What do you think they thought about what they had just seen? The crossing of the Red Sea. Where would your faith be when you saw something like that? You saw the whole Egyptian army, including Pharaoh, destroyed in the depths of the sea. And now, lo and behold, here you are 3 days out, and why'd you bring us out here in this wilderness to die? Does that baffle your mind? It does mine. I'm having trouble with this thing, just so you know, but we'll figure it out.
What it points out, and it's even true today, the focus was on themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
Not on
Yes.
God. It's what they needed, what they were very selfish in not seeing that. And again, that is a challenge for, I know for me sometimes is I kind of thinking about I don't have what I want or whatever, when I realize I have everything I want.
Oh, yeah.
I should say everything I need that God has provided.
Yeah.
And we lose sight of that focus.
And they did. They lost sight of that. There's a place out from where we used to live in Lancaster called Jawbone Canyon. Remember Jawbone Canyon? I never went to that place, except I would think of the wilderness much like what the children of Israel were wandering in. And if any of you, and some of you I know have, you've traveled across the Mojave Desert, and you say, man, this is an awful place. When I first came into the Mojave Desert and I saw all this dry stuff and just nothing, my thought was, wonder what they would pay us to take some of this. And then I began to price some of the real estate, and they're right proud of that desert. But I think of it when I go out to Jawbone Canyon, because in the Mojave Desert where we live, there's not a whole lot of rocks and that sort of thing. But as you get out to Jawbone Canyon, it looks kind of like this. How would you like to have the welfare of 2 to 3 million people to care for in a place like this? You see, there's some things that we need to learn about God. And this period of time, what we traditionally refer to as the Sinai Peninsula, was kind of barren. And yes, there was a lot of people. And yes, you would expect them to have needs for water and food. But what's God teaching them during this period of time? I will provide. Dependence upon God. Now, we noticed a week ago, we had a chart. In fact, I may have one or two more of that, where we've got the way of Shur and the way of the coastal travel paths. And these would have been the most direct across the northern end of the Sinai Peninsula, traditionally called the Sinai Peninsula. And that would have been the most direct route. But to be in this barren country, not particularly following the traditional trade routes, they would have needs that they would not find along those trade, or that would not be available to them as they might have been in those trade areas. And so God is teaching them, you've got to learn. So here's the trade routes. Going across the top, you've got the way of the sea, the way of Shur, and of course the King's Highway going up the other way. We're not talking about that just yet. But what we want to learn is that they come down to Moriah 3 days out, and we're fussing and complaining, need to have water. Now, you'd think that would be the end of it, but no, that was not the end of it. Their next stop was in a place called Elam, and you still are up to Exodus, the 15th chapter, 12 wells there, 70 palm trees, and what do? Well, we got water here, but what's the problem with it? It's bitter, okay? Now, let me ask you, dear friends, if you were out in a barren, desert, desolate place, some of you have been in circumstances like this, and you've got water to drink, it would satisfy the need for water, right? It would hydrate you, but I don't like the taste of it. Any of you ever drink sulfur water? Oh, I kind of like the taste of that. My mom thought I was nuts, but I kind of like the taste of sulfur water. You thought I was nuts too, okay? There's a place not far from where I grew up called Sulphur Well, and people would go up and drink the water and get containers of it and take it home. They thought it was good for you to drink that sulfur water, you see. But see, they came to this place. There's a lot of water there, but we don't like the taste of it. So what'd they do? Complained. And of course, we see that Moses took a particular log, if you please, chunk of wood, and put it in the water, and the water became sweet. They could drink it, so they were thankful. Now we like the taste of the water. And of course, traveling along the arm of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Suez, you say, well, there's a lot of water there, right? It's right there. Why can't we drink it? Salt water, all right? So got all these minerals and salt and such in it, so we can't drink that. So what do? Complain, all right? And then they travel on just a little bit farther, and they come down into the wilderness of Sin. Now we're all the way to Exodus 16. And you'll notice that we're altogether a month out of Egypt, a whole month. And what are they doing? They're complaining. See, we don't have food to eat. And so it was here that God began to provide for them manna. And they ate manna, and they ate manna, and they ate manna, and they got tired of manna. And what'd they do? Complained. And so here we go again. And they travel just a little bit further, and they come on down into this area. And when God began to feed them with manna, they got tired of that and complained. And what did God do? Quail. Any of you ever eat quail? Oh, it's pretty good, isn't it? Now, they had so much quail. As good as we might think that quail is, how much quail did they have? Enough, yes. They had so much quail it was running out of their nose, so to speak. And so they got tired of eating the quail. And what'd they do? Complained. Now, you're seeing this all in a short picture, right? Just small intervals between these great and fabulous provisions that God is providing for them miraculously. He's caring for their every need. And they complain, and they complain, and they complain. Now, we need to be impressed with that because this is just not good. God fed them. He fought their battles. We notice at Rephidim, the Amalekites attacked them. God fought for them. They were not defeated. And so here we go. On down, we approach Mount Sinai. And again, the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai. You'll notice in the text, Exodus about chapter 18, 19, long in through there. We're in the 3rd month. Now, look at what's happened in such a short period of time. Out from the Egyptian period of time. 3 months. Now, what'd you see in Egypt? You saw these plagues smite the Egyptians, while at the same time, you didn't want for anything. You had what you needed. And then when you came to the Red Sea, God opened up the sea. You walked across on dry ground. Now, just think about the miracle of the ground being dry. You know, here seawater has been on the floor of this thing for a long, long time. And you walk across it on dry ground. what would you expect it to be if it wasn't miraculous? Well, it might be a little muddy, huh? But they came across on dry ground. And then when they were on the other side, here comes the Egyptians, and the waters collapse, and the Egyptians are gone. And we see the song of Miriam singing, we saw the Egyptians today, but we don't ever want to see them again, and we won't, because this is the promise of God. Now, when you look at things like that, how impressed are you? I want to think just really impressed. Would you have trust and faith and confidence in God when you got to the other side after seeing this, that you might think that your strength and your trust would last longer than 3 months? So what happened? Why didn't theirs? They saw all these miracles. But we're just 3 months out. And look at all the fussing, complaining, ridiculing against God. You brought us out here into this wilderness to die. Now they're fussing at Moses and Aaron, of course, but ultimately they're fussing at God. What did you do? You brought us out here to die. We had it better back in Egypt as slaves. Now, when I read things like this, and then I come over into the New Testament and I read in John chapter 5, 6, and 7 and read about the great miracles that Jesus wrought, and I see the reaction of the Jews of Jesus' day, does it not cause you to think about what they did historically? And then when they fuss at Stephen and say, Stephen, in Acts chapter 6, all you did was you complained about Moses, and you wrote about Moses, and you fussed about Moses, and you spoke against the law, and you spoke against the temple. And Stephen goes back through their history and says, no, that's not me. That's what you've always done. The forefathers, they've always done that. And I wonder why sometimes a lightning bolt just didn't come out of heaven and just take them off the face of the earth. Now, you know the answer to that. The plan of God had not been complete at this point. So God exercised patience and long-suffering with these people. Now, as we come to Mount Sinai, God makes a covenant with Israel, giving the law of Moses. And this brings us to Exodus chapter 19, and I want to call your attention to this text. Exodus chapter 19. And you remember what God said to Abraham back over in Genesis 12 and Genesis 22? Made 3 promises. What were they? Land, let's order them a little bit different. Land, nation, and seed. Okay? Because the seed was, of course, the ultimate one that was fulfilled in Christ. More on that as we get farther along. But when he makes this covenant with them, they said, we will do everything that Jehovah has said. We're going to obey the commandments of God. Question, have they done that so far? Now, what makes you think they're going to do it now? If you want to look to somebody's life and say what he's going to do in the future, what does the best predictor, what is that? Look back, see what he's done in the past. And that's a pretty good indicator of what you can count on down through the pike of time. But if you'll notice in Exodus chapter 19, in these first few verses, we'll notice specifically in verse 5, I need a reader. Who wants to read verses 5 and 6 for me? Ben, would you read that, please? Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6.
Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel.
All right, notice that with me if you would. God is speaking now to Moses, and he tells Moses about this people. This people is going to be a holy nation. Now, what was it God promised Abraham way back when? Going to have a great nation. Of course, when God said that to Moses, or said that to Abraham, he didn't have a child, an old man. But now he's had children and descendants, and now God himself calls this people a holy nation. Now, if you're making check marks about God keeping his promise, this is a big one. God did just exactly what he said. But you'll notice that the Israelites said, we will do everything the Lord has said. Do you see a bit of a contrast here? God is always faithful. He never lies. He always does what he says. But what about the children of Israel? Have we seen enough of their history to know that their reputation is we're not going to do what he says? We're just not going to do what he says. And that's the way that it went. Now, I want to call your attention just a little bit to this map because we've got Mount Sinai, otherwise called Mount Horeb in Old Testament history. Exodus 19, and of course, what did God do for them in Exodus chapter 20? Gave the law. Now, this is supposed to be a picture of Mount Sinai. Again, I don't know that it is. It could very well be. Mount Sinai may be on the other side, as we looked at the map previously. But what we do know is God made a covenant with them, and we see that identified. And if you're studying with somebody and that somebody says, you know, all we've got to do is keep the Ten Commandments. You ever have anybody tell you that? We just need to keep the Ten Commandments. We've got to be faithful to God, but we've got to keep the Ten Commandments. You want to look at passages like Exodus 20, and you also want to look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, beginning in the first part of both of these chapters. And notice to whom the Ten Commandments were given, keeping in mind that the Ten Commandments were somewhat of a summation of the law. But you'll notice in verse 2 of Exodus 20, you'll see the same thing, worded just a little bit different in Deuteronomy chapter 5, but it says, I am Jehovah thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee a graven image. Verse 7, thou shalt not take the name of Jehovah thy God in vain. What are we reading? Ten Commandments. Who were they given to? The children of Israel, those who came up out of the land of Egypt. The account in Deuteronomy 5 says those who came up out of the house of bondage. Well, is that you? Did you come up out of the land of bondage? Now, I know there's some folks say, well, we come up out of the land of bondage of sin, and they try to make an analogy here. Let's not get that complicated. The Ten Commandments weren't given to everybody, were they? The Ten Commandments were not given to you. The Ten Commandments were given to those who came up out of the land of Egypt. Now, let's just let that stand. Now, somebody said, well, are you saying then that the Ten Commandments are not bound upon us? Well, they're not bound upon us because they are the Ten Commandments. They're bound upon us because they're repeated in the New Testament. And they're not in a list like this, but you can find every one of them except one in the New Testament. And what is that one? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. We don't do that. And no, the Catholic Church did not change the Sabbath day to the first day of the week. That's not the case. What we find is in the New Testament, those early Christians gathered together upon the first day of the week to worship God, to observe the Lord's Supper, to lay by in store. And you see that actually introduced in Acts chapter 2, that you see the specific day mentioned in Acts chapter 20 and in verse 7, of course, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. Now, looking just a little bit further, the people of Israel, they said, we're going to keep the commandments of God. We're going to agree to this covenant. Question, do you have to agree to God's covenant to be bound by it? No, you don't. You really don't. Now, some covenants, and of course we know that God made a whole bunch of covenants. We're not going to take the time to elaborate on that, but God made a whole bunch of covenants. This is just one of them. But you don't have to agree to keep God's covenant to be bound by it. Now, that's just a mistaken concept. Some covenants you agree to, but this one you don't. You don't have to. And what we want to note in this is this covenant was sealed. It was confirmed with the sacrifice of animals. Now, at Mount Sinai, again, they said, we're going to do it. We'll keep what God said. And, of course, God organized them into a holy nation with specific rules. We know in Exodus chapter 25, the instruction given to Moses regarding the building of the tabernacle, make it according to the pattern. And lots of valid lessons regarding that instruction repeated for us in the New Testament in the book of Hebrews. But what we want to note here is this first promise that God made to Abraham, I'm going to make of you a great nation of people. It's fulfilled. God did what he said he would do, and we're going to notice that repeatedly in our study. However, the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai in the third month. Okay, the law was given in the third month. Now that takes you from Exodus 20 all the way over to Exodus 32. And what did they do? While Moses is up there getting the rest of the law, They said to Aaron, make us gods that's going to go before us. And of course, you recall from Exodus chapter 32, if you'll look at your Bible, what did Aaron instruct them to do, and then what did he do? I want your gold. Yeah, break off all the gold, and what did he do with it? Go ahead, Gary. He made a calf. He used a graving tool and made the golden calf. And then how did he explain that? When Moses came down off the mountain and he heard the noise of the people, he thought, well, a great banquet is going on. They're happy about something, got a little closer. No, that's not what's going on. And what did he find them doing? Go ahead.
Well, Aaron said the people made me do it.
People made me do it, yeah. So they're down here worshiping this thing, and Aaron explained the people made me do it, all right? And his explanations just makes you, again, want to bat your head against the wall, because he said, I got their gold, and I put it in the fire, and out walked this calf. It just walked right out of there, see? Sure it did. No, the text tells us that he made it. And of course, then Moses wanted to know, what did the people do to you to make you do that? Well, these people, they're rebellious people. Yeah, right. Aaron, that was not your place to do that. Now, we raised the question, why a golden calf? That was not the only gods that they worshiped over their history, but this was one of the first. Why a golden calf? Where had they been? In Egypt. What did they worship in Egypt? What did the Egyptians worship? All right. Yeah, you remember the disease of cattle? See, this was one of their things. Bring this up out of the land of Egypt. Idolatry, worship the calf. All right, so make us a golden calf. And was God real happy with them when they did that? Well, not hardly. But again, I want to call to your attention how soon they're doing this. I think sometimes we've got the history down, we've got the events that happen, but the connection between them, we sometimes lose that. Look at how quickly they're doing this. Moses is up on the mountain getting the law. They're only 3 months outside of Egypt, where they've seen all these great things that God did, and now they're wanting to worship a calf. How do you explain that? Well, you just shake your head, because there is no explanation for that. They just didn't believe God. They didn't believe in God when you get to this point. And Moses was furious with them, and how furious was God with them? Yeah. And so we see Moses pleading on their behalf, and he did not wipe them out. Now, look again. Here's our map. We're coming down through here, going very fast. All right, and look at how the things just begin to develop. And I just shake my head and say, why did they do that? And I've added these maps to some of the things that we studied last time, and we're going to pursue beyond these very quickly, because as you study through the book of Numbers, how many of you have done much of a detailed study through the book of Numbers? Probably not too many, okay? It's kind of a difficult study, but one of the things you'll notice through the book of Numbers is this same pattern, repeated, and repeated. For example, as you come on up through this period of wandering, we come to this place called Kadesh Barnea. Now, they're not too awful far out. You see, the trip has not taken all that long. We're about 2 years in, okay? And when you take 2 to 3 million people across a barren wilderness like that, it's going to take you a little while. But here we are at Kadesh Barnea, and what did Moses do? Numbers 13. Sent in the spies. All right, you remember this story. Sent in the spies.
Well, one of the things that sometimes we lose in this, we talk about the people grumbling. God still had faithful people. Yes,
Oh,
yes. Joshua and Caleb.
Yes.
Were
Yes.
faithful.
Yes.
Not everyone were grumblers.
Well, that's right. Not everybody was. But you know, when I think of Joshua and Caleb in this text of Numbers 13 and following, what I think about these two characters, Jesus said in Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14, enter ye in by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, broad is the way. You're familiar with it. And many are they that enter in thereby. But Narrow is the gate and straight in the way that enters into life, and few there be that find that, or find it. Now, when you look back at the masses of Israelites, 2 to 3 million came up out of the land of Egypt. And here we are about 2 years into the journey, and all that were 20 years old and older that were allowed to go into the promised land was Joshua and Caleb. Few there be that find it. Of course, they were told, those little ones that you thought would be a prey in the land, be destroyed, eaten up by all the people of this foreign new land that you thought would be a prey, they're going to go in. But all of you 20 years old and older, only Joshua and Caleb will go into the promised land. Now, when you go over that and over that and over that with folks, and you're trying to illustrate what he meant by few there be that find it, this is a pretty good illustration to understand just how few really are. Okay? Now, again, in the book of Deuteronomy and Numbers and Deuteronomy, we want to notice these passages. And real quick, who wants to tell me about Korah up here in chapter 16? Korah had this brilliant notion. We need to be doing more. So what did he want to do? He wanted to assume a role that was not his. So Korah and those who were followers of his, those priests, we know that they were smitten, and 250 of them were swallowed up by the ground. They died. What did the people do? 250 of these false prophets died. How did the people respond to their deaths? We got a word here that just keeps coming up. They complained. Yeah, that's what they did. They complained. Well, you'd think that 250 people just swallowed up by the earth, that they would say, hey, maybe we better be careful about what we say. We come on over to the 16th chapter of a little farther in the same chapter of the book of Numbers. And what the people do, they complained. And then what happened? They're murmuring, complaining. Look at number 16, beginning. Pardon me? There's a plague. Oh, yes. And this passage is so emphatic because the plague started and people start dying just right and left. People are dying wholesale. And Moses told Aaron, go and prepare an offering to stay the plague. Now, do you think that Aaron just kind of dilly-dallied around about preparing this sacrifice or preparing the offering? I wouldn't think so when he sees people dying by the masses. And you'll notice that in verse 45. And following, we note that Aaron took a censer, verse 46. He put fire in it from off the altar and lay incense there. Notice he took the fire from off the altar. We'll come to that later. But one of the things we want to note is he ran, verse 47, and tried to stop this plague. But by the time he got all that done, how many died? 14,700 people. Now, I know we look at modern day wars and conflicts and all that sort of thing, and we get excited if there's maybe 100 people died. Would you stop and pause and maybe take note if 14,700 died? And that's right on the heels of 250 dying. The earth just swallowed them up. And then, as you turn over to Numbers chapter 21, what are the people doing yet again? Murmuring. And God sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and the people began to cry unto Moses, get rid of these snakes. Now, I'd be all aboard on that, right? Don't like snakes. So Moses began to beseech the Lord about these fiery serpents. And did God take them away? No. No, he did not. All right, he provided the means whereby if anybody was bitten by a poisonous snake, he could live. So God told Moses, take a serpent of brass, put it on a pole. If anybody looks upon it, it's been bitten, he'll live, he'll not die. And you see that emblem today on many of these little white coats that you see running around. Okay, we're familiar with that, right? We know where that came from, right here in this text, Numbers chapter 21. Now, one of the things we want to note about that is before the people began to cry to Moses, get rid of these snakes, what's happened? Much people died. Now, dear brethren, do we not see that the numbers are just escalating? And the cause is always the same. They're complaining, they're fussing, they're murmuring, they're not happy with what God has done for them. And then if you just turn the page over to Numbers chapter 22 through 25, we read about a man who wanted to curse the people of God. You remember that? Who was he? Balaam, yes. And so we've got this foreign king that wants these people to be cursed. And we've got Balak, that's the foreign king's name. Balak wants these people cursed. So he finds Balaam, a prophet, that's going to tell him how to do that. And Balaam, he was just straight up with Balak. He said, if I go and try to curse these people, I can't do anything except God told me to do it. I can't do any more, can't do any less. Now that's very admirable, isn't it? But every time he would try to curse these people, what happened to them? God would bless them. And finally, Balaam told Balak, if you want to really curse these people, you want to see God punish them, then he said, you bring in these Midianite women, and you begin to spread these Midianite women among the people, the men of Israel, and see what happens. And what did happen? What did the Israelite men do with these Midianitish women? What did they do?
Intermarried.
Well, yes, they committed fornication with them. So we've got gross immorality that's existing among the Israelites regarding these heathen women. Now, there were a couple of things wrong with that. These Midianitish women were not Israelites, so they were not to intermarry. They were not to have anything to do with them. And so we got a problem. But because of the sin of fornication, 24,000 Israelites died. Now, I didn't put a calculator to that to add up all these just in these passages. But that's a whole lot of people dying in a relatively short amount of time. And we might raise the question, well, why? Why are people dying so rapidly? They didn't obey God. Yes, of course. And of course, we've got the sending in of the spies and all of that. And God said, this generation's going to die. You'll not go in. But look at how rapidly they're dying. By the thousands at a time. Because they're not doing what God told them to do. Now, would that get your attention? You see, we're just traveling along up this path. And they're not doing what God told them to do. And the Hebrew writer tells us that because you did not believe me, your bodies fell in the wilderness. Unbelief, that was the primary thing. They didn't believe God. And so here we've got that. Now, how much time I got? About 5 minutes?
Less than that now.
The conquest of the whole land in less than 5 minutes. All right? Well, we're going to go through this quickly because I think maybe I can do that. We note that the people that inhabited the land from Deuteronomy 7, they're listed and they occur over and over again. We see that list in Genesis chapter 15 in a host of places. But we note that they're instructed to go in and take the land, and they're going to do that. We've got the Amorite, the Canaanite, and the Hittites, and the history of those people, the Jebusites, all of these people. But we've got them, the Israelites, then coming into the land. Now, to come into the land, what do they have to cross? Jordan River. All right, now there's a lot of similarities you're going to notice between the crossing of the Jordan River and the crossing of the Red Sea. And that takes us back to Joshua chapter 4 very quickly. We note that Joshua is told in Joshua chapter 1, you do what I tell you to do, you'll lead them in. You'll do exactly what I told you to do. We are going to skip over Rahab in the 2nd chapter, but as you come to the 4th chapter, we note that God has instructed them, 3rd chapter, verse 10, that you might know that God is with you. You're going to see some pretty fabulous things coming up. And as you get into the 4th chapter, he tells them, you're going to cross over into the promised land. Now, when the priest's feet that carry the Ark of the Covenant reach the edge of the water, you follow them where they go. And what's going to happen to the waters of the Jordan River? Well, they're going to part. Now, one thing that when you're studying with somebody you want to take note of is in verse 15, it tells us, for the Jordan overfloweth all its banks at the time of the harvest, all the time of the harvest. What's happening to the Jordan River when they cross? Flood time, yeah. It's flood season. And when the priests put their feet in the edge of the water, what happened to the waters? They parted and they went across, you'll notice again, verse 17, on dry ground. Now, one of the things that we've noticed about the Jordan River, and I'm hastening, one of the things we've noticed about the Jordan River is that it comes from where? The mountain, all right, at about 10,000 feet elevation. And so when we're coming down here, we've got water that's, well, it's very plentiful, all right, during its flood stage, and it's running very rapidly. And what happened to the waters of the Jordan River? Now, you remember, and I should have put your image up here, Jim, because that would display this in excellent fashion for us. To see this big draw down through here, all right, big gulch. Got mountains over here, you got mountains over here, and when the priests put their feet into the water stopped and just began to back up. Well, it's got 2 mountains on each side. It's not going to overflow, but it's going to stop flowing down here. So the people went across on dry ground. Now, as they went across on dry ground, we note that they were told, as Joshua leads them in, pick up a stone, one for each tribe, and you put these stones at the place where you've come across. As you get across, you make a pillar of these stones at Gilgal. Now, that's really fascinating to me, because when they made the pillar of stones at Gilgal, what purpose did it serve? Go ahead. Remember, much like the Passover, you see some parallels here, because at the Passover they said, when your children ask, what means this feast? You tell them about what the great God of heaven has done. And now when you're coming across and your children see, or you're traveling in this area of Gilgal, and they see this pillar of stones, and they say, what does this pile of stones mean? You tell them the great things that God has done. Now listen very carefully. On this point, if they were traveling in this part of the country and their children see this pillar of stones and say, what does this mean? Would it be academically correct to say, this is where we crossed the Jordan to come into the promised land? Would that be a correct answer? Well, yes. But is that what God said to teach your children, just to mark the location? No. Teach them what God has done. Now, there's a contrast I really want you to take note of in verses 23 and 24 of Joshua chapter 4. You'll notice that their fathers had come across the Red Sea, but this text tells us, for Jehovah your God dried up the waters of the Jordan from before you until ye were passed over, as Jehovah your God dried up the Red Sea, which he dried up from before us until we were passed over. You see, their children didn't see the crossing of the Red Sea. There were kids that were born over in this wilderness and all that. All right, we got to quit.